This is Richard M. Stallman speaking at the University of Cincinnati, Cincinnati, Ohio, on the 24th of January, 2000. Introduction by Bradley M. Kuhn of the Cincinnati GNU+linux Users Group.
Hi everybody, my name is Bradley Kuhn. I've been asked by the University of Cincinnati and the Cincinnati GNU+linux Users Group to give a brief introduction of our honored speaker this evening. Before I introduce the speaker, I would like to first thank both the Cincinnati GNU+linux Users Group and the ECCS department at the university for making this event possible. And the sign-in sheet for those of you in the seminar course who are supposed to sign in, to pass this around, make sure you get to give the Dr. Slip so you guys get your credit for your class. So, Mr. Stallman has dedicated his career to ensuring that computer users can accomplish any computing task with only free software. A number of prestigious organizations have honored Mr. Stallman's efforts. In 1990, he was awarded the MacArthur Foundation Fellowship. In 1991, Mr. Stallman received the Grace Hopper Award from the Association of Computing Machinery for his early work on the Emacs editor. In 1996, he received an honorary doctorate from the Royal Institute of Technology in Sweden. In 1998, along with Linus Torvalds, he received the Electronic Frontiers Foundation Pioneer Award. Thus, it is an honor and a privilege for me to introduce to you our distinguished speaker this evening. I would like to introduce the President of the Free Software Foundation, Mr. Richard M. Stallman.
I never quite understand what we're applauding, but people do it, so I figure I better join in. Well, I'm going to be speaking about the GNU project and the free software movement. How we developed a free operating system and nobody knows it. But more important, I'm going to be talking about issues of politics and society, what kind of society we should be living in, what kind of social rules we want to live under. Most of the time when people think about the questions of what the rules should be for using software, they're usually owners of software companies, and they usually take a completely selfish approach, asking what rules can we impose on the public so we can benefit. Now, I had the good fortune in the 1970s to be part of a software sharing community, a community of programmers where it was normal to share software with everybody. And because of this, I came to look at that same question from a different direction, asking what makes a good community, a good society for people to use computers in? What kind of rules for the use of software make possible a community? And because of this, I reached completely different answers from the ones that the software privateers reach. In this community, you walk by some other hacker sitting at a console and saw something interesting on the screen, you'd say, hey, what is that? Oh, that's the new foobar program which we just got from Stanford. It's in the foobar directory. So you'd look in that directory and there you'd find an executable that you could run, source code that you could read and study so you could learn how they solved those problems. And then after running the program, you might get ideas. You might find bugs that you wanted to fix. You might find that some feature didn't quite work or wasn't there. Or you might just get ideas for additional features, additional capabilities. Well, you could fix the bugs. You could add the features. And in addition, you might find that there was some piece of the program doing a particular subjob that was useful in some other project you were working on. So you could just cut that piece out and put it into your program, where it would do another job. We used to call this cannibalization, although it's not quite appropriate because the old program wasn't destroyed by this. So you could use a program not only by executing it, but in all the various ways that a program is useful. And sometimes one program would be developed by one person after another over periods of a decade or more. You could look at it growing sort of the way a city grows. And you could look at certain pieces and say, oh, by the style I can tell this must have been written a long time ago. Because nowadays people wouldn't do it that way. Conventions change over time. Just as you walk around in some cities and you see old buildings and you realize that was built a few decades ago or a few hundred years ago. And being part of this community, I got a very good feeling. I felt we're all working together to advance human knowledge. We're not working against anybody. We're not trying to hold somebody else back or for some petty goal like beating out somebody else. No, we're working to make humanity better off. But I realized that it wasn't like that for everyone who used software. In fact, that most people who use software use proprietary software, which means that horrible, painful restrictions were placed on them in using the software. We got a taste of what this was like when Xerox gave the MIT Artificial Intelligence Lab a laser printer. Now this was a nice gift in some ways because it was the first time anybody outside Xerox ever had a laser printer. And it was really a high-speed office copier that had been modified into a printer. And this was very fast, it had high resolution, and the straight lines came out straight and sharp. But it was also unreliable. It frequently got paper jams. Now, we knew what to do about that because our previous printer, which was slow and lower resolution and tended to make vertical lines waver a bit, also was unreliable. It would get paper jams or run out of things fairly often. And to cope with that situation, we couldn't make the printer itself work better, but we changed the software to compensate for the shortcomings of the printer. We were able to do this because that old printer was controlled by free software. We had the source code. We could make any changes we wanted to. And so we added a feature that any time a printout was finished, the system displayed a message for the user saying, your file foo has been printed, displayed on your screen right away. So you had to wait because the printer was slow, but you didn't have to wait extra just because you didn't know when the printout was finished. And then there was another feature which I recall I added myself, which was anytime the printer got in trouble, the system would display a message for each user currently waiting for printing, saying, the printer is in trouble, go fix it. Now, if you got that message, you would know that only a few people were going to get that message. So you couldn't just assume someone else will fix it, I don't have to go. You would go to the printer. So a minute or so after the printer would stop running, 2 or 3 people would arrive, at least one would know how to deal with the problem and would teach the others. And so the printer would get running again very soon. In effect, we treated the user as part of the system. We put in end-to-end feedback, and we obtained reliable operation for the system as a whole, even though the printer component was still unreliable. And that worked well. So when the new printer had similar problems, we wanted to solve them the same way. But then, there we ran into a brick wall. You see, this printer was controlled by a special Xerox spooling computer running proprietary Xerox software. Xerox wouldn't let us have the source code for that software, so we were helpless to make changes in it. Even though we were as good programmers as you could have found anywhere, we couldn't do anything to that software. We were totally helpless. In effect, the whole AI lab was prisoners of its software because we were unable to change it to make it do what we needed. And this was very frustrating. So you type the commands to print a file, and a few seconds later it would say, your file foo has been spooled. Well, what else is new? It's always spooled in a few seconds unless the beam is down. So at that point you go back to work. And a while later you notice the time. Oh, it's been half an hour. Nah, not long enough. So you go back to work, and a while later you notice the time. Oh, it's been a whole hour. Maybe it's printed now. So you go upstairs to the printer and you see it's been jammed the whole time. So at that point you fix the jam, you go back to work, and a while later you notice the time. Oh, it's been another half hour. Maybe now it's printed. So you go back to the printer, and there you see it printed 300 pages of other people's stuff, which was around, that would have been around 5 minutes of printing, and jammed again. And at that point you say, I'm going to stand here and fix this damn printer every time it jams until my stuff comes out. So it was frustrating over and over. But what made it even more frustrating was to realize that we could have solved the problem, except that somebody in Xerox didn't want to let us solve the problem. Somebody was deliberately obstructing us, deliberately inflicting this frustration on us for some ends of his own. And so every time this happened, we had to be angry at those people at Xerox, as well as frustrated. It wasn't just the natural perversity of things. It was somebody's deliberate interference. Then I found out that somebody at Carnegie Mellon had a copy of that source code. Eventually I visited Pittsburgh, so I went to his office and I said, I'm from the MIT AI lab, could I have a copy of the printer software source code? And he said, no, I promised not to give you a copy. I was so angry I couldn't think of a good way to express it, so I just turned and walked out without saying goodbye. Well, this was very bad for me and for the MIT AI lab, because we never got a copy of that source code, and it was frustrating to use that printer for as long as we had it. Goodbye. But in a paradoxical way, it was very good for me, because it taught me an important lesson. You see, that guy at Carnegie Mellon had promised to refuse to cooperate with us at MIT, but he didn't just do that to us. He probably did it to you too. And chances are, he did it to you too. And most likely, he did it to you too. In fact, he probably did it to most of the people in this room, except maybe some of you weren't born yet in 1981. And in fact, he did it to he promised not to cooperate, to refuse his help to just about everybody in the world, because he had signed a non-disclosure agreement. The lesson I learned was, this was my first experience, direct experience with a non-disclosure agreement. I was the victim. I and my whole lab were the victims. And the lesson I learned was that non-disclosure agreements have victims. They are not innocent, harmless conveniences. They're doing somebody else wrong, maybe a lot of people. You don't know who. I promise that I will not help fill in the blank. Blank to be filled in later by circumstances. So you don't even know who you're betraying when you betray. It may be somebody you hate, it may be a stranger, it may be your best friend. You won't find out until the time comes. Most people first encounter a non-disclosure agreement when they're invited to sign one. And there's always some kind of temptation, some goodie you're going to get if you sign. And so people make excuses. They say to themselves, oh, I'm not really hurting anybody, and this is the way it's done, who am I to disagree, and they're never going to get this anyway, so why shouldn't I participate in depriving them, and if I don't do this, somebody else will. All the usual excuses and a few special ones. But when I was invited to sign a non-disclosure agreement, I had already learned what they really are. And I couldn't turn around and do to somebody else, somebody who probably was not going to be an enemy. Now, I had no reason to assume I would be hurting people who deserved it. They could be anybody. I had to assume they would not deserve to be hurt. What have you become if you start treating everybody at large as if they deserve to be hurt by you? So I was faced with doing to other people the same wrong that had been done to me and my whole lab. And I couldn't justify that to my conscience. So I said, thank you very much for offering me this nice software package, but I cannot in good conscience accept it on the terms you have offered. So I'm going to do without it. Thank you very much. And I have never knowingly signed a non-disclosure agreement for generally useful technical information, the kind of information which makes humanity better off, if it's available. Now, there are other kinds of information. If you wanted to talk with me about what was happening with your girlfriend and you asked me to please keep it a secret, I could do that, because that information is not generally useful information. It's probably not technical information either. Now, there may be related generally useful information, but the specific details are not generally useful. So that I could keep a secret for you if you wanted me to. But if some generally useful thing came out of it, like some wonderful new sex technique, I mean, it would be my duty to promise not to tell. I could only promise not to tell the details about you, so I wouldn't have to mention where I got it from. I wouldn't have to mention you at all. I could conceal that aspect. Although why you'd want me to conceal that aspect? Wouldn't you want to be famous for it? No! Well, maybe if you had discovered it with somebody other than your girlfriend, maybe then I could understand why you'd want me to keep it quiet about you. But although that brings up totally different ethical issues, you know, I don't believe in possessiveness about other people. That's not morally right. But the point is that there's a difference between personal information and generally useful technical information. As somewhere between a scientist and an engineer, the purpose of my work is to develop generally useful technical information and make it available. If I conceal it instead, I am betraying the mission of my field. So I have decided I will never do that. However, at about the same time that I had those experiences, a series of blows fell on the community I belonged to, which wiped it out in the end. And the ultimate blow was when digital discontinued making the PDP-10. You see, our whole system, the system of software that we shared with anybody who wanted it, was started in the 1960s. It was written in assembler language. The only high-level language we had was Lisp. So when it was written for one particular kind of computer, and when that was discontinued, the whole system was junk. It was useless. And the only way that you could get a modern computer back in, say, 1983 and use it was to get a proprietary operating system, which meant you had to sign a non-disclosure agreement. 1983 or so, yeah.
Everybody wrote CPM.
What?
Everybody wrote CPM by then.
Maybe, but that didn't run on a real computer. I'm sorry. To me, a 16-bit computer is just not a real computer. What can I say?
I'm 4-bit.
Oh.
I started 4.4.
Anyway, So that put me in a moral dilemma. Well, I mean, I guess conceivably I had the possibility, but of course, I couldn't keep working in my own field the way I had been doing it before, because that depended on being part of a community which no longer existed. So what were my alternatives? Well, I guess maybe I could have worked on these 4-bit computers, but that didn't appeal at all. Well, I could have gone along with the way things were changing. I could have started using non-free software and signing non-disclosure agreements, and I'm sure MIT would have had me start developing proprietary software, because lots of universities develop proprietary software. Don't think that proprietary software means commercial software. Those are two independent parameters. Well, I realized that if I did that, I could have fun coding, which I couldn't have done on a 4-bit computer, and I could have made money, especially if I left MIT and did it someplace else. But at the end of my career, I have to look back and say, I have spent all this time building walls to divide people, and I decided I couldn't ethically justify that, couldn't live with myself for doing that. So I decided to look for another alternative. And there was an obvious alternative. I could leave the field of computers, which would not have been too different from working on 4-bit computers. Now, many programmers don't seem to recognize that this is a possibility. They say, the employers who hire programmers demand this, this, and this. If I don't do those things, I'll starve. That's an exact quote. Well, even in the United States, even today, there are millions of people who make a living not from writing software. Now, I had no other special skills, but I'm sure I could have become a waiter. Not at a fancy restaurant, I suppose, but somewhere. Now, being a waiter, there's nothing unethical involved. And you're not going to starve. Think about that. But being a waiter would have been no fun for me, and it would have been wasting my skills. Even though I would have avoided misusing them, I would still be wasting them. So I decided to look for another alternative. What could an operating system developer do that would actually make the world a better place? Given this situation where the only operating systems available were proprietary, what if I wrote another operating system that wasn't proprietary? What if I wrote an operating system and said to everyone, share this, change this, you don't have to sign a non-disclosure agreement. Go ahead and cooperate again. That could change the situation for everyone. So I realized that the skill of an operating system developer was exactly what was needed to open a third way to get everybody out of the moral dilemma that I was in. Now, this was a very big job, and I didn't know if it was possible to finish this job, developing a whole operating system. But at least it was worth trying, so I decided I would try to develop a free operating system. The next question was to make the major design decisions about the system. Well, I had just seen one system turn into junk because it was written for a particular model of computer that was discontinued. I didn't want that to happen again. So it was clear this system had to be portable. Well, at the time, I knew of one portable operating system that was actually a success, and that was Unix. Unix also had some good ideas. By the standards of the day, things like pipes and redirection and shell programming, the simple fork and exec system calls were particularly good. So I decided to follow the design of Unix. And I decided also to be compatible with Unix. I realized this was important to make the system win acceptance from users. You see, I realized that if I looked at the best ideas from the systems I had helped to develop and the other systems I had read about or used, and put them all together with my own favorite ideas, I could have designed my own dream operating system. But I realized that if I showed that to users, they would say, well, this is very nice, but we've already written our programs to run on Unix, so we don't want to rewrite them. thanks, but we're not going to use it. Well, I wanted to create an alternative of freedom that people would really use and enjoy, not just make an excuse and say, well, I offered them freedom, they didn't take it, so don't blame me. So I realized compatibility was essential to achieve that goal. So I decided to make the system compatible with Unix, and that meant all the major design decisions were made. Because Unix consists of a large number of separate components that communicated using interfaces that were more or less documented. To be compatible meant using the same interfaces, which meant that the remaining design decisions mostly were within one particular component, and they didn't have to be made until somebody started writing that component. They didn't have to be made then. There was just one other major design decision, which was that I was not going to try to support 16-bit computers the way Unix mostly did. And the reason was that this was going to be a very big job. I had to try to make it easier. Now, when you're dealing with a computer with a small address space, the job becomes a lot harder. So I realized I could make the job easier by saying I insist on at least 32-bit computers. And I figured it would take several years to get a system running, and by then 32-bit computers would be generally available, and that's what turned out to happen. So, all the design decisions were made. The next thing I needed was a name. The hackers always want to find funny or naughty names for things. And there's a hacker tradition that, after all, your fun is half the purpose at least, so you want to have fun with the name too. So there's a hacker tradition that says when you're making a program that's like some existing program, you can give it a name which is a recursive acronym saying this program is not the other program. For example, in the 60s and 70s there were many Pico text editors, and most of them were called something or other Pico. But one clever hacker had the idea of calling his program Tint, for Tint is not Pico. The first recursive acronym. In 1975, I developed the first Emacs editor. That was followed by many more or less compatible Emacs-like editors. And most were called this Emacs or that Emacs or who's what's this Emacs. But one was called Fine for Fine is not Emacs. And there was Sign for Sign is not Emacs. And then there was Ina for Ina is not Emacs. Then Ina was almost completely rewritten, and the new version was called Zwei, for Zwei was Ina initially. So I decided to find a recursive acronym name, but it didn't take me more than a minute to discover that all the obvious four-letter possibilities were not particularly funny because they weren't words. So I tried varying it a little bit, and I discovered that the word GNU, which is one of the greatest sources of humor in the English language, would work as a recursive acronym for this system if I made it stand for GNU is not Unix, just a simple contraction. By the way, when the dictionary says that the correct pronunciation is GNU, let me tell you what really happened. It's a loan word from an African language. And the original pronunciation has a click sound in it. Then the British arrived and colonized the place, and they didn't want to bother learning to pronounce click sounds. So they just said new, and they wrote it with a G to indicate there's something here we're not pronouncing. And then some other British people who were working on a dictionary said, well, British people say it this way, and they write it this way, so those are both correct. Anyway, when it's the name of our operating system, please pronounce the hard G. Pronounce it GNU. Say it 1, 2, 3, GNU. Because if you call it the new operating system, you'll get people very confused. We've been working on it for 16 years now. It's not new anymore, but it still is and always will be GNU. So, we had a name. Next thing was to look for funding. I wrote a description of the project addressed to computer manufacturers saying, you are spending millions of dollars a year on Unix license fees. How about if you contribute $50,000 to this project? If you do that and a few other companies do that, there is a substantial chance that starting a few years from now, we will save you, 100 times what you spent. And some executives started out by being interested, but there was no useful follow-up. So after a few months, I gave up on that, and I said, never mind the funding. I don't want to spend years waiting around accomplishing nothing except trying and failing to get money. I'm going to start writing the code instead. So I announced the project to the public, and then in January 1984, I quit my job at the MIT Artificial Intelligence Lab to start the GNU project. Now, I had to quit my job because universities have been known to take the software developed by their staff and turn them into proprietary software products. Now, my purpose in writing this software was not just to advance technology or to have a success. I was working to give people freedom. And if the freedom was interfered with by MIT, that would defeat the whole purpose. I had to make sure that wouldn't happen. The only way to do that was to quit the job and take MIT out of the equation. So I went into Professor Winston's office, and he said, do you still want to quit? And I said, yes. And he said, do you want to keep your key? Okay. So I started developing GNU using MIT's Unix machine. And this was actually the first time I ever used Unix. So I was never a Unix wizard the way some other people were. And I never got to see what Unix was really like until I started the GNU project. And fortunately, I started discovering at that point some of its flaws and deficiencies, but fortunately, most of them were reparable. There were a few ways in which it was actually a step backward from the other systems I was used to, which we can't repair because it would be an incompatible change and it would cause more harm from the incompatibility than it would do good from the superiority. So we're stuck with it. Like the fact that when you rewrite a file, first it truncates the file to 0 length, and then it starts writing stuff into it, and if anybody reads the file during that time, they get an inconsistent who knows what. Not very clean, Back in 1970, people knew how to do better than that. Anyway, at that point, I thought that I and other people would join together, we'd write piece after piece, and eventually we'd have a whole system and we'd say, come and get it. And then people would start using it. That's not what happened. In September 1984, I started working on GNU Emacs, which was my second implementation of Emacs. By early 1985, it was working well enough that I could actually use it to do all my editing, which was nice because it meant I could actually edit on the Unix machine where I was doing the compilation. I had no intention of learning to use VI. So until that time, I did my editing on other computers and saved the files across the network. Well, when Emacs was good enough for me to edit with, it was good enough for lots of people to edit with, so people started asking for copies. And that meant I had to work out the details of distribution. Of course, I put a copy into the anonymous FTP directory, and that was good for people who were on the network. But in 1985, even most programmers were not on the net. So the question was, what would I say to them when they asked for copies? I could have said, I want to spend my time coding, writing more of GNU, not writing tapes, so find a friend who's on the net who will download it for you and put it on a tape for you. And I think most of them would have found somebody who could do that for them. But I had no job, and I was looking for a way I could make some money from free software. So I announced, send me $150 and I'll mail you a tape of Emacs. So I started a free software business. Now, some people say to me, what do you mean it's free software if it costs $150? Well, the English language has more words than any other, but it has still has some strange, unaccountable deficiencies. And one of them is that we've got one word, free, for several meanings. One meaning of free refers to price, another refers to freedom. When I say free software, I'm talking about freedom, not price. So think of free speech, not free beer. I realize that may be hard for college students, but make an effort. It's good for you. Freedom is good for you, and beer isn't really. So, some people got their copies of Emacs by copying it over the net and didn't pay me anything. Others got their copies by paying me money for a tape. Others got their copies from friends and didn't pay me anything. Maybe they paid their friends something, but probably not. You know, if you just made a few copies occasionally for your friends, you wouldn't ask them to pay you. You'd do it as a favor. So some people paid money and some didn't. But all of them got the same freedoms, and that's the important thing. You see, I didn't start the free software movement because I want programmers to get less money. I don't mind when I get paid money, so why should I mind if you get paid money? It's the same ethical situation, whether it's you or me. The issue here is to have freedom. I want to have freedom, and I want you to have freedom. The people who got copies of Emacs had certain crucial freedoms. And so let me now give the definition of free software. A program is free software for you, a particular user, if you have the following freedoms. Freedom 0, the freedom to run the program for any purpose. Freedom 1, the freedom to help yourself by changing the program to suit your needs. Freedom 2, the freedom to help your neighbor by distributing copies of the program. And freedom 3, the freedom to help build your community by making improvements and publishing them so that other people can get the benefit of your work. If you have all of those freedoms, the program is free software for you. Now, freedom 0 doesn't require too much discussion because most software gives you freedom 0. So any program which does not give you freedom 0 is particularly restricted. And also, legally, freedom 0 follows as a consequence of freedoms 1, 2, and 3. So, I won't say much more about freedom 0. I'll go on to freedom 1, the freedom to help yourself by making the changes that you need. This could mean fixing bugs, could mean adding features. Either way, in order for freedom 1 to be effective, you have to have the source code. If you don't have the source code, then even the most trivial changes, like using 4 digits instead of 2 digits for a year, are nearly impossible. And by the way, not having source code was one of several major factors contributing to the difficulty of the Y2K upgrade and the expense of it. Now, freedom number 1 is important. It's obviously useful to anybody who's a programmer. It's also useful to any businesses that use software. If you're using software in your business, then even if you're not a programmer and nobody in the company is a programmer, if you need something changed, you can go and hire a programmer to do it. The same as if you need the walls in your office moved, well, maybe nobody in your company is a carpenter, but you can hire one. Free software, this freedom, the freedom to change the software, is also useful even to people who are not going to make the changes themselves and are not going to pay somebody to. For one thing, you may have a friend who is willing to make a small change for you, and even if you don't, somebody else may share the same desires you have and may decide to make that improvement, and then it may become available to you to use as a result. So this freedom potentially benefits everyone, And I should also mention that while most people surely will not learn to become good programmers, really learn the skill of programming, anybody can learn a little bit of programming, and sometimes you need a small change made. Sometimes a small change can make things a lot more convenient. So for a large number of people, they will be able to make use of this freedom in some ways, even if not in all ways, directly. Now, I've already explained what it's like not to have this freedom, how it causes practical material harm. It makes you a prisoner of your software. But in addition, it causes a kind of psychosocial harm. It damages people's morale, their enthusiasm for their work. When you have to do your work using something that has been set up to be hard to use by somebody who's callous and doesn't care, to protect yourself from frustration, you must stop caring about whether you get work done or not. That's the only way, it's the only response people will make, unless they have a tremendous reason and tremendous mental strength. And most people don't have the mental strength, and most jobs don't give you the reason to use it if you have it. So it leads to people having an attitude like, well, I showed up for work today. Whether I can get anything done, that's not my problem. And that's not good for society or for the people involved. So that's freedom one, the freedom to help yourself. Freedom two is the freedom to help your neighbor by redistributing copies of the program. The fundamental act of friendship for beings that can think and learn is to teach each other. When you teach somebody else, when you share knowledge and useful information with someone else, you can give something without losing it yourself. When these beings use computers, this fundamental act takes the form of sharing software and other useful materials that are on the computer. If you don't have the freedom to engage in this fundamental act of freedom, that causes practical material harm. It causes the software to be wasted. If the program has an owner who, by any means, it doesn't matter what means is used, establishes a situation where every user must pay to use the program, the result is that some users will say, all right, I'll pay, and other users will say, never mind, I'll do without it. And every time somebody says, never mind, I'll do without it, the program is going partly to waste. Somebody who would have wanted to use it is being discouraged from using it. You see, this price causes a financial disincentive discouraging people from using the program. And it works. It has an effect. It causes some people not to use the program. However, the work it takes to develop the program to any given level of power and quality is the same regardless of the number of users. So you do the same work. It does only a part of the good. That is deliberately inflicted waste. So that's practical material harm. But because it is deliberately inflicted practical material harm, it also causes psychosocial harm, which affects the spirit of goodwill, which is the fundamental resource of society. It's the difference between a society and a dog-eat-dog jungle. The fact that people have goodwill, at least many people do, for a large part of the circumstances they can favor they're asked for, except for some women, I guess. But that's a whole different political issue there. But all of us will do some of the favors we're asked for. When it's not too hard, when it's important, we do favors for other people, or at least most of us do. And the ones who are exceptions are a real pain in the neck. If you ever have to deal with somebody whose attitude all the time is, what's in it for me? That's no fun. Now, this spirit of goodwill is such an important resource of society that we make efforts to spread it and encourage it and teach it. So what does it mean when the governments and other powerful institutions start telling everybody, if you share software with your friend, that's evil, that's stealing? What does that do to this resource our society depends on? And what happens when the government says, if you share with your neighbor, that means you're a pirate and will put you in jail? How much fear is it going to take to convince people not to share with their friends? Do you want to live in a society permeated by that level of fear? I don't want it to get there. And that's why freedom number 2 is so important. Well, of course, there are other theories that say it's not important. One other theory said central planning was the answer. If you tell everybody what job to do and how to do it, then society will function and everybody will work together and it will go smoothly. Well, people generally believe that theory was a failure. There's another alternative theory that if everybody is greedy and cares only about direct advantage, that through enlightened self-interest, people will negotiate contracts and that will make everything work smoothly. I guess you could call this the worship of the invisible hand. Well, if you look around at the places like the United States where this has been tried, it's a failure too. Although a few people were benefiting from it, and they like to go around paying the media to say it's a success. But basically, it's a failure. It's been a failure for most Americans since Reagan started trying it. Most Americans now have to work harder just to make the same pay since 1981. So basically, if we want a livable society, we must have this resource of goodwill. Now, it's interesting to compare the measures that are being used to try to stop people from sharing copies with their neighbors. Because the U.S. is not the first country to attempt to stop people from redistributing useful and important information. The Soviet Union did this too. They went to great lengths to try to stamp out private, unauthorized copying of information, which was known as samizdat. And how did they do this? Well, there were 5 basic mechanisms. One was harsh punishments for anyone caught. And 2, they looked for informers. They tried to convince everyone to inform on their co-workers and friends. And, I forgot to mention, really number 1 is to guard all the copiers. Every copier in the Soviet Union had to have a guard watching what was copied. Then we have, the others are 2 and 3, and 4 is collective responsibility. You're supposed to watch all of them. If I catch any of them with illegal copying, you're going to prison. And 5 was propaganda starting in childhood, to teach people that only monsters would ever engage in this kind of forbidden copying. All of these 5 methods have been proposed and many even put into use in the U.S. at the request of the media companies through the actions of their agents, the U.S. government. Guards on copying equipment, that's part of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. Of course, in the U.S., since human labor is expensive, they don't require human guards. The idea is to use robot guards, to require robot guards in your computer and make it a crime to turn them off. So you're not free to program your computer anymore either. And harsh penalties. Until a few years ago, non-commercial copying of copyrighted works and distributing them to your friends, not getting anything in exchange, was not a crime at all. Now it's a felony. This is more important than sticking knives in people on the street, because the software owners are more important than you. Looking for informers. In Boston last summer, there were ads in the subways asking people to turn informer, turn stool pigeon, and call the Software Publishers Association. And collective responsibility, well, in the U.S., the method being used is Internet service providers. Every time an Internet service provider gets a complaint, they have to take the materials down within 14 days. They have to do this every time, or else they are directly liable for everything that there's a complaint about. So it's very effective enforcement, and it's even being used to hush up embarrassing internal documentations, internal documents from companies about how they're cheating the public. There's an article by Brian Pfaffenberger, I think it's in Linux Journal or something like that, about it, how Ford Motor Company did this. Somebody leaked some documents about how they knew about defects in some cars and posted it on the internet. Their website's been taken down. They can't get this information out to the public anymore. Really convenient for any company that wants to swindle the public and endanger the public. Oh, and the last thing, propaganda, starting in childhood. When I went to kindergarten, the teachers were trying to teach us to share, inculcate this goodwill that society needs. So if you brought any candy to school, they would say, you can't just eat it all yourself, you've got to share it with the other kids. Nowadays, according to the administration, they're supposed to teach the kids to say yes to licensing. Their words. So if you bring some software, oh no, don't share the software. Sharing is wrong. Sharing means you're a pirate. Sharing is no good for the media companies and the software companies, and they are more important than living in a good society. So this is why I consider freedom number 2 to be the social reasons for freedom number 2 are the most important reason why software should be free. But moving on now to freedom number 3, the freedom to help build your community. That is the freedom to make an improvement in the software and publish it so that other people can use it and then they can build further improvements on top of it. Now, many people said to me in the past, if the software is free, nobody will get paid to work on it, so why would anybody work on it? Well, nowadays we can compare that theory with empirical facts and find out that both halves of the argument are wrong. A number of people do get paid to write free software, and B, lots of people work on improving software with free software without getting paid. In fact, there's people who have noted a phenomenon that when a free program catches on, it tends to get lots of people working on it. For instance, when I released gnu+linux in 1985, people started sending me bug fixes and new packages to add new features, and more bug fixes and more new features and more and more and more. So they were pouring in on me so much that merely to do the work to digest all of their help was a big job. Microsoft doesn't have that problem. And there are people who have noted this phenomenon and pointed out that free programs that catch on tend to become very powerful and very reliable. And they argued that software should be free, or more precisely, they say users should have these freedoms simply to get powerful, reliable software. Those people call themselves the open source movement. Now, the open source movement was founded 2 years ago, and it avoids mentioning these issues about freedom and what kind of society we want to live in. In fact, they avoid it like the plague. And instead, they argue for about the same conclusions using practical benefits only. Now, I agree with that position as far as it goes, but I think that we must talk about things that go beyond these practical benefits. Having powerful, reliable software is a good thing, but it's not the only important thing about our lives. We mustn't stop talking about what freedom we want to have, what kind of community we want to be part of. So this is where the free software movement differs from the open source movement. In the free software movement, we put those issues, those deeper issues, front and center. Because there's more than just practical convenience at stake here. Now, if you don't have freedom number 3, the freedom to publish improved versions, then practical material harm results because this process of improvement can't go on. But in addition, there is psychosocial harm, which affects the spirit of scientific cooperation. The awareness that we can develop human knowledge more effectively if we work together rather than against each other. The spirit of scientific cooperation once was so strong that scientists cooperated sometimes even when their countries were at war. I read that U.S. Marines landing on an island in the Pacific Ocean during World War II found a building with a note on it. The note was addressed to them. It said, "This is a marine biology lab. Please take care of our specimens and our notes. We put them in order because we want American scientists to continue our work." The note was written by Japanese scientists. And even though their country was at war with our country, they didn't want that to obstruct the progress of biology. They didn't care if it was American or Japanese scientists who finished up their work and made it feed into the future developments of biology, as long as it didn't get lost. But today, it's as if every little band of scientists and engineers is at war with every other little band, trying to hold them back and keep them in the dark. It's like gang warfare within our society. And I don't see why we should allow that kind of gang warfare to continue. So those are the 3 freedoms that distinguish free software from most software, and the 6 reasons why they're important. These reasons led me to the conclusion that all published software should be free, that all software users are entitled to these freedoms and should never be asked to give them up. Now, I've defined the term free software with reference to a particular arbitrarily chosen user. I did this for a reason, because sometimes whether a program is free depends on which user you pick. Now, that might seem strange, so let me illustrate with an example. The biggest example of this is the X Window system, which was developed at MIT and released by that group as free software. If you got the software from MIT, then that made it free software. That meant you had these freedoms, so it was free software for you. But among those who got the software from MIT were various computer manufacturers that distributed Unix systems. They changed, maybe 1% of the code, maybe that which might have been a few thousand lines, to make this X run on their system and put it into their Unix system and distribute it under the same non-disclosure agreement, distributing binaries only to their customers. So for their customers, X Windows was not free software. What they got was proprietary software, user subjugating software in the same way as Unix was. So this led to a paradoxical situation where if you ask the question, is X free software or not, the question depended on where you made the measurement. If you made the measurement coming out of the developers group, you'd say, yeah, over here I observe all the crucial freedoms. Over here it's free software. If you looked at the average of the users, on the average, what freedoms does a user of this software have, typically it was not free software for most of them. Most of them didn't have any of those freedoms. Now, the people who developed X didn't mind this because their goal was to have a big success. To develop a Windows system that would advance the state of the art, and would set a standard and become popular. Well, it did those things, and they were happy. But I had a different goal. I was working to give computer users freedom. And if the same thing that happened to X were to happen to GNU, it would make GNU a failure. So I developed a method of stopping this from happening, and that method is called copyleft. You can think of copyleft as being copyright flipped over. The idea is, first I say this program is copyrighted, which means by default it's prohibited to copy it or redistribute it or change it. But then I say you can modify it, and you can copy it, and you can redistribute it. You can even distribute the modified copies with a condition. When you distribute any copies, whether you verbatim or modified or enlarged, you must do it under precisely these terms, no more and no less. So whoever gets the copies from you gets the same freedoms that you got from me. So as copies of the program spread around, the freedom goes with them. Nobody can strip off the freedom and make a restricted user enslaving binary and distribute that. Or at least we can sue them if they do, and maybe even get them prosecuted. So, in effect, copyleft creates inalienable rights. These fundamental freedoms that define free software become inalienable rights for the users of that software. And that's my goal, because these should be the inalienable rights of anybody using published software. But I can't legally change that for all software, but I can, using copyleft, try to set it up for the software that I write. Now, copyleft is a general idea, like, compiler is a general idea. You can't run the general idea of compiler. You have to have a specific compiler written in order to run that. Likewise, to use copyleft, you need a specific implementation. The particular implementation of copyleft that we use for most software in the GNU project is called the GNU General Public License. That's a particular license written in legal law, which we put on most of our software. There are a couple of other forms of copyleft that we use for certain other pieces of software. And then there are other forms of copyleft that we use for documentation. And right now, I'm developing a more sophisticated copyleft for free software. Which was called the GNU Free Documentation License, which is to be used for manuals. So it's a different kind of copyleft adapted to the specific practical needs that we have regarding manuals. Anyway, some free software is copylefted. Other free software, like the X Windows system, is not copylefted. But it's all free. In other words, it's all basically morally okay. The people who developed X Windows, they did not employ copyleft to defend your freedom, but they didn't take away your freedom. So X, although it is not copylefted, and I think they should have copylefted it, it is available as free software for use in free software systems. What next? Well, once gnu+linux was available, I decided it was time to make another effort to raise funds, because at this point people could see that GNU was not just vaporware. We actually could develop software that people wanted to use. I forgot to mention. When I started offering to sell these tapes, at first orders began dribbling in, and by the middle of 1985 they were trickling in. I was getting maybe 8 to 10 orders a month, and that was actually enough for me to live on, because I live cheaply. I've always made a point of resisting the expensive habits that most people seem to be eager to get attached to. You know, most Americans, they start making more money, they immediately say, what can I blow all this money on? Not only that, but what can I turn into a habit so that I not only have to blow the money now, but I have trouble ever stopping. And they get expensive cars and houses and paintings and adventure vacations and children. I mean, all sorts of expensive commitments, you know, it's hard to ever stop. And then they say, oh, I know I'm doing something wrong to get this money, but I have to do something wrong in order, because I need this much money to live. But they don't really need it if they resist acquiring the expensive habits in the first place. So, by focusing on living cheaply, you can be your own master. You can decide what you'll do with your life instead of letting money decide what you'll do with your life. You know, these people, they thought that it might be fun to have children, and then they got divorced, and now they have to spend their whole lives struggling to make lots of money for kids they'll hardly ever see. So sad. And they all thought that for them it was going to work out well. They weren't going to have it come out badly. But you know, it happens badly to a lot of people. So it's not unlikely it'll happen to you, and I figured it was not unlikely it would happen to me. So I decided to learn from other people's mistakes or misfortunes. I'm not sure I would say that they all made mistakes. It may just be a likely kind of misfortune, which means it's even more likely it would happen to me and to you. So I was in a position to decide to do what I felt was important with my life. But anyway, to make another attempt to raise funds, in October 1985 we formed the Free Software Foundation, which is a tax-exempt charity to raise funds to develop free software. The idea is this way we can hire people to write free software, and we do that. But in addition to asking for donations, the FSF also took over from me the service of selling Emacs tapes. And to our surprise, we've always got more money from selling copies of things that people are free to redistribute than from straight donations. And this is interesting because lots of people have told me this is impossible. It violates the laws of economics. And this is what they tell me over and again. People tell me the same exact theory. They say, you'll be able to sell one copy only, because whoever buys that one copy will start making more copies and selling them, and will charge less than you, and everybody will buy from them. Nobody will buy from you again, so you'll never sell another copy. You only sell one copy. That is the theory. Well, let's look at the facts. Lots of people do have copies, and most of them don't turn around and sell more copies, but some of them do. And they usually charge less than we do because we try to charge more than they. And most people buy from them, and some people buy from us, and we sell copy after copy, and we have a steady revenue stream. So you see, they're wrong. I just love refuting the laws of economics. Well, what the point is that they described a conclusion that is approximately true, and they treated it as if that meant it weren't exactly true. But often there's a big practical difference between 99% true and 100% true. It can make all the difference between success and failure. And in our case, it does. So, through the 1980s, we needed to develop replacements for loads and loads of different components of Unix. And that's what we set down to do. You know, I did it, and the friends joined me, more and more of us. And then sometimes we got lucky, and somebody else wrote a good replacement for some piece of Unix for some totally unrelated reason. But it did the job, and it was free software, so we could use it. And X Windows sort of falls in that category. Although Unix in 1984 didn't have a Windows system, but I had already worked on developing a couple of Windows systems, and I had decided I wanted to make the new system user-friendly, so it had to have a Windows system. Fortunately, though, MIT developed X. I saw it was reasonably good and that it was catching on, so I decided we're not going to write a Windows system for GNU. We're just going to use X. So one large job we didn't have to do. That's very good, because the job was so big, most people said we couldn't possibly finish it anyway. We had to look for shortcuts. So some of these components became available from someplace else, and we didn't have to write them. But most of the components, most of the time we weren't so lucky. So for every component, if it didn't drop into our lap, we had to write it or recruit somebody to write it. And eventually we developed the GNU task list, which was a list of the pieces that were still missing, so we could direct people's efforts towards filling in the remaining gaps. Some of the work was done by staff of the FSF, the people that we hired, using the money that we raised. Now, when we had enough money to pay one person, I had to make a decision. Would that one person be me? So, you know, it's not unusual for a foundation to pay its president. But I realized, though, that paying Stallman a salary would be throwing away the money, because I knew I could get Stallman to work for nothing. So I decided to hire somebody else instead and have two people, right, instead of just one. So that rule remains till this day. And there's also once I started getting invited to go to exotic places like Cincinnati or India and China to give speeches, in Paris, you know, I decided, you know, if I let the FSF pay for these trips, then that would make a mockery of the claim that the FSF is not paying me personally, because I'm getting to enjoy these trips. So I made the rule the FSF cannot pay for my travel except locally, you know, to take a cab within the city to an appointment. And that rule I also stand by. So I have to get the trips funded some other way, which is good because it means I'm raising funds for the work. And the fact that I'm a full-time volunteer is very useful, because when I ask other people like you to volunteer, maybe only part-time, for the GNU project, I'm asking you to follow where I'm leading. If I were getting paid so it were a cushy arrangement for me, and I'm asking you to volunteer, well, you might not be so influenced by that request. But actually, although some important work has been done by the staff of the FSF, like developing the GNU shell, Bash, the Born Again shell, is why it's called Bash, and the GNU C library, and a lot of work on various other programs. Most of the work on GNU has been done by volunteers. And we have other full-time volunteers too. Now, some of them are retired, some of them are actually getting paid, but by somebody else. Like maybe they work for computer companies, maybe they work for universities, maybe they work for free software support companies, maybe they started their own free software support businesses, which is what I had to do once I stopped selling the Emacs tapes because the FSF was doing it. I had to find another way to make a living. So I started doing free software support. People would commission me to make, teach them a class in Emacs list programming or port the GNU-C compiler to some other platform. And, I would charge them an arm and a leg, and after a little while of this, I'd say, well, gee, I've made so much money, I have enough to live on, an equal amount to save, an equal amount for taxes. Why do I want to work for money anymore this year? So I often was turning away business because I was doing this. Many people say they're working to make a living, but they're making lots of money for luxuries. I really was doing work so that I could make a living, but what I really wanted to do was do whatever work seemed most important for GNU. So as soon as I had made enough, I wouldn't take any more paying work that year because I wanted to do the work that seemed important, not the work somebody wanted to pay for. Anyway, by the early 1990s, the system was almost finished. In fact, there was only one important missing component, and that was the kernel. I had been looking for a way we could avoid having to do the kernel from scratch. And so we sort of put off the kernel till last. And at that, we started it in 1990. And I decided to use an advanced architecture, a message-passing microkernel, which we managed to get from Carnegie Mellon. It's called Mach. And then on top of that, we had to write emulation for the usual features of the Unix kernel, things like file systems and network and so on. But it turned out that this architecture was very hard to get working reliably with these asynchronous multi-threaded processes sending each other messages, very vulnerable to timing errors. And it was really hard to get it right and to get it debugged. And it took till 1997 before we could even manage to release a test version. Anyway, in 1991, Linus Torvalds wrote his own kernel using a tried and true monolithic approach, and he got his to work reliably in a short period of time. Now, we didn't know about it at first. He didn't tell us. But he announced it to other people, and they started looking around saying, what can we put together with this kernel to make a complete system? And they looked around, and lo and behold, everything they needed was already available. What good fortune, they thought. So they put all those things together with Linux, and they started calling this a Linux system. In truth, what they were doing was putting Linux into the gap in the GNU system, producing a modified version of the GNU system, which had Linux as its kernel. So really, what they produced was the combination of GNU and Linux, which I call gnu+linux. It's much more GNU than it is Linux, but we might as well give credit to Linus as well by mentioning the Linux part also. Unfortunately, most of the users have heard about the system from the companies and magazines and users groups that call the system just plain Linux. So the result is the GNU project succeeded in its stated goal. We, with the help of many others, of course, produced a free operating system which is now in use by an estimated 20 million people. And most of them don't know we did it. Now, people sometimes say to me, well, does it really matter if people know who did it? The important thing is that the job is done. So why make a fuss about credit? And that's actually a very wise view. If the job really were done, then I could just sit back and relax and say, you know, I did this and now I can do something else for humanity. And there are plenty of things that need doing for humanity. And even though my special skills are not particularly appropriate to most of them, I could probably help somehow. But the job is far from done. And what we've accomplished so far is not even secure. So now I want to tell you about the problems we face, which is the remaining major issue I should talk about. Uh-oh. Oh, here they are. By the way, if you want some,
Dude, over here.
Intermission.
Are you eating this one at a time?
No. I'm trying to hurry so I can get back to speaking and not keep you waiting too much.
Got a cheeseburger. One cheeseburger?
Now I don't want to spoil my appetite for dinner. Anyway, we're in a situation where we have a community that's growing very fast. Lots of people coming into the community trying out the gnu+linux system because they've heard about practical advantages, like it's powerful, it runs fast on computers a few years old even, and it doesn't need as much memory, and it's reliable, it doesn't crash, you know, all sorts of good things, but they're all practical things. But hardly anybody is talking about the more fundamental things, such as the freedom that people can enjoy as a result of not using software that restricts your freedom. And the result is most users haven't even recognized that it can be looked at from that point of view. So in effect, it's like having a city where large numbers of people have been pouring in from the countryside, making shanty towns, and not being incorporated into the civic structure of the city, not being taught the civics of their city. And that means that our freedom doesn't have firm roots. When most of the users haven't even thought about it, aren't even aware about it, they're not going to make an effort to defend it. And people who have switched to free software because of purely practical advantages will switch back to proprietary software just as easily next time it offers them some kind of practical advantage, like, you know, it enables you to read Word files. You know, I care about freedom. So if somebody starts sending me Word files, I'm not going to install Microsoft Windows and Word so I can read them. I'm going to send them back and say, sorry, you sent this in a proprietary format, and I can't read it. And that's what you should do too if you value your freedom. But most of the users haven't even thought about it that way. They haven't even decided whether they value their freedom. They don't know that there's a freedom to maybe value. And so all the strength we've built up in our community is very flimsy. It could blow down very easily as soon as there's a practical inconvenience to be faced. And there are many such. There are many challenges we have to face. For example, hardware doesn't stand still. Old products are being discontinued, new ones being developed, and often the developers of a new hardware product won't tell the public how to use it. Now that might seem disgusting, that they'd sell you a piece of hardware and refuse to tell you what it does, but that's actually not unusual. All they give you is a proprietary driver that can run it. Well, that means you've got to give up your freedom to run that, to use that hardware. At least the way things are now. So what can we do about that? Well, one thing that we can all do is use market pressure, apply market pressure. We can refuse to buy the hardware which is not supported by free software. And with 20 million of us, it might get to be significant. But will we exercise our power? Most of those 20 million don't think of this as a matter of principle. They say, oh, well, I can use this system. It's a powerful system. I don't care if I use a non-free driver. If practically speaking, who cares? So we don't use the power at our disposal to win this battle. And so we lose it instead. And there's another thing that we can do. We can reverse engineer to figure out how that hardware works and then write free drivers for it. But reverse engineering is really hard work. Is there going to be somebody who cares enough to do that much work just for the sake of freedom? That depends on whether people have learned to value freedom. What the future of our community depends on what we value. And then will we be allowed to reverse engineer? The software hoarders are trying now to push a law called UCITA, which they're trying to push every state to adopt this law, which would make it possible to prohibit reverse engineering and lots of other worse things too. You should all take a look at www.badsoftware.com. What?
Is that resin?
No. And it's a lawyer who's concerned with the issues of whether the software developers are liable if they give you lousy software that they know doesn't even work. And one of the effects of UCITA is, UCITA is so horrible. It would permit them to say, well, we're giving you this software on a license, and we can change the terms of the license at any time, and if you don't like the terms, you just have to stop using the software. It would actually be legal for them to do that if UCITA is passed.
Isn't that what GPL2 says at the bottom?
No.
It says
GPL, no.
version of the
It says you have the choice. You see, so we can give you new permissions, but we can't take back any permissions we've given you before. See, I thought about this ethical issue, and that's why I wrote it that way. For most GPL-covered software, if we release a new version of the GPL, you have the choice to use the new version of the GPL. But you can also use the old version if you prefer. So if we put a new permission into the new version of the GPL, you get that. But if we make the new version of the GPL tighter, for the old software, you still have the old permissions that you got before. We can't impose a new restriction on you. But UCITA would make it legal for the software privateers to impose new restrictions on you at any time. And they could even legally program their software to sabotage your system if you aren't obeying their criteria. And this applies to anything that has software in it, like cars. So, you buy a car under UCITA, they'll come with a license that says, we can impose new restrictions on you at any time, and otherwise you have to take back the car. And if there are any defects, we're not responsible at all. Anything in the car. I can't do that now.
Why would it be viable for them to do that? Because people have the choice of what they buy.
If everybody does that, you see, indeed, if there's something that most people find so obnoxious they won't buy it, then the companies will stop doing that particular thing. But we call this the land of the brave and the free, but most Americans are not ready to make any practical sacrifice for the sake of their freedom or their rights or their future interests even. Look at we're in a society where people are borrowing lots of money on their credit cards. That's not long-term thinking in most cases. So there may be a few especially nasty things that people would generally reject and the companies would stop trying them. But most of the nasty things, most people would accept them, which means that all the companies will do them, so you won't have any chance to reject them. That's what you see the means. So will we fight this? That depends on whether we're used to thinking of the issue in terms of political freedom. So again, the future of our community depends on what we value. Now, sometimes there are a lot of companies that develop non-free software to run on top of gnu+linux. And all the magazines that call our system Linux, they're filled with ads for this software. And all those ads have one message in common. Now, they may be ads for 50 different programs, but there's one thing they all say, and that is non-free software is good for you. It's so good for you, you would even pay to get it. And they call these things value-added packages, which makes a statement about their values. They value convenience, not freedom. Because I have different values, I call them freedom-subtracted packages. So if somebody gets into a conversation with you about value-added packages, you should start responding with freedom-subtracted packages. You know, don't let them define the basic ethical assumptions with their terminology. Anyway, these things are becoming very popular. And if you try to get a commercial distribution of the gnu/linux system, of course they usually call it just Linux, you'll almost always find that it contains a lot of non-free software added on as a bonus. And in fact, the only commercial distribution maker who gives you a free alternative is Red Hat. They have something called Red Hat Means Source Linux, which is an all-free distribution. The others don't even give you the alternative. So if you want to get a commercially packaged distribution of gnu/linux, you should get that particular Red Hat one, then you'll get only the free software.
What do you use?
Actually, I prefer Debian. Debian has a pretty good policy about non-free software also. Debian is a non-commercially developed distribution. And their policy on non-free software is not as good as I would ask for. But they do at least rigorously separate it out. So if you know that what you want is an all-free installation, it's easy to get that using Debian. The official Debian system consists only of free software. But on their website also they have pages about the non-free packages, so it's not quite as good as a clear a separation as it ought to be. Anyway, so if it becomes sort of the normal accepted practice to have all these non-free bonus things on top of a free system, if that's what all these 20 million people are doing, in some sense freedom has fallen by the wayside. And it can get even worse than that, because sometimes these non-free programs are used for software development. Sometimes they're the basis for other software. For example, a library or an interpreter. And when that happens, the other people may intend to write free software, and they may make their programs free, but they won't run without the help of that non-free program. And that means that all that non-free software essentially has fallen into a pit, because we can't use it in a free system. Now this happened 10 years ago or so with Motif. Lots of people used Motif to develop other programs, and maybe those programs were free, but we couldn't run them. And then about 5 years ago, the same problem started happening with another library. Well, we dealt with the Motif problem. Eventually, people started developing a free replacement called Lefty. And starting about a year or two ago, LessKeep actually started working well enough that you really can use it for most applications that were written for Motif. So we solved that problem, but it was a lot of work and it took most of the decade. A few years ago, a similar problem developed with the Qt library, which was a non-free library, but you could distribute it at no charge. You could have it and run it at no charge. You weren't allowed to distribute modified versions of it, though. So it was not free software. But because it was available, a large project for free software development started to use Qt as the basis for their work. And as the more they did, the more they started inviting other people to come join them. So it was like a whole bunch of people in a pit saying, "Hey, everybody, come jump down and be trapped with us." Well, this was a really bad problem. And we had to do something about it. So actually we tried to do two things. One was starting a project to develop a free replacement for Qt. And the other was developing an alternative body of free software that was developed not using Qt. The body of free software that used Qt was called KDE. It's a desktop. So we just started GNOME, which is the GNU desktop. This was such a serious problem, we had to start two parallel efforts to try to solve the problem, for redundancy's sake, because any given effort may or may not succeed. And it turned out that the Qt replacement, which is called Harmony, has not really taken off. It isn't ready for use yet. But GNOME has taken off. And as a response to GNOME, last year, the developers of Qt re-released it as free software. They didn't say it's a response to GNOME, but it's pretty clearly so. Because the community was mounting a vigorous response to this danger. Now we have another such danger, Java. Sun's Java implementation is not free software. The licenses are painfully restricted. Some of the source code is not available at all. But, programmers are looking at Java and thinking, this is so sexy, this is what I want to do, I'm going to ignore the fact that it's not free software. So they're rushing down into the trap. Well, we're working on free software for Java to get them out of the trap. But, it's so much easier not to fall into the trap than to get people out of it. So we must spread the awareness of this problem so that programmers will think about the problem and not fall into the trap. So again, our future depends on what we value. If people think about it in terms of, am I contributing to the free world? Then they'll look at, hey, I shouldn't use this Qt library, I shouldn't use this Sun Java interpreter, because those are not free. If I use them, my software depends on them, and it's not available to the free world. The reason people fall into these traps is that they're not aware that they are traps. And then there are more challenges. We have a free operating system, but an operating system is the first thing you need to start making use of a computer. It's not the only thing you need. You need applications too. We now need to have a wide range of free applications. See, right now, a lot of people use gnu+linux, and on top of it they use non-free applications. Well, that's better than using the non-free applications on Windows or Unix. But it's not full freedom. To have full freedom, you've got to stop using the non-free applications too, because they put chains on you too. So we've got to develop free applications. We can't settle for the state where we are with the non-free applications on top of gnu+linux. But there are a lot of people who think that that state of affairs is perfectly fine, because they don't look at it as a matter of freedom. So essentially we've taken one giant step towards freedom that people said we couldn't do. And now we have a lot of smaller steps to take But will we remember to take them, or will we forget about the goal of freedom? There are not enough of us talking about freedom. We're not teaching the people to think about it. And then there's another issue, documentation. Documentation is an essential part of every software package. And if the software is free, the documentation has to be free. After all, when you redistribute the software, you should redistribute the documentation with it. You don't want to give somebody the program with no manuals. And if you modify the program, maybe that means the manual's not right anymore. If so, you should fix the manual. You should make it accurate for your modified program. If the manual doesn't allow you to do these things, it's not acceptable. So, documentation for free software must be free in the same exact sense of freedom. This has been a real struggle because a lot of programmers get excited about free software and volunteer to work, but not many technical writers get excited about free software and volunteer to work. And most programmers don't know how to write an acceptable manual. It's a skill. Most programmers haven't even learned how to tell what is an acceptable manual. Their idea of what they're trying to do when they write a manual is totally wrong. They think that they should give the logical foundations first. And they think they should tell you how to install a program before they even tell you how to use it. Anyway, but some programmers, some of the people who've written free software could write good manuals. But the problem is they didn't realize that we needed free manuals. So they wrote good manuals and had them published in the usual non-free way. So they're a good manual that we could have had just slipped through our fingers because somebody who cared about our community didn't understand the issues. So once again, our future depends on what we value. Fortunately, now some commercial publishers are getting interested in publishing commercial free manuals. That is, the manuals give you the requisite freedoms, but they are published commercially and they sell copies and they make money. And if this catches on, it may solve the documentation problem. Otherwise, the FFF has a tech writer on staff who's finishing up the shell programming manual. Because we've got to have manuals. There are loads of free programs that everybody uses which have no free documentation now. It's a terrible situation we're in. Well, I've saved the worst problem for last. The worst problem is software patents. Patented algorithms, patented features, which say, you're trying to write a program, which is a big program, but you can't put in that feature, and you can't use that algorithm, and that feature, and this combination of features, and those two algorithms, and that one, maybe 50 different patents will cover different parts of what you need to do. It turns software development into something like crossing a minefield. Because at each design decision, chances are you won't step on a patent that time. But to get all the way across without ever stepping on one, you don't have a good chance of that. Now, software patents are bad for everybody trying to write other than tiny pieces of software. Because you have to use lots of different ideas, and the danger is that some of them are already patented by somebody. But they're especially bad for free software developers because it isn't feasible for us to license a patent. The usual terms for a patent license require you to pay per copy. We can't do that. We don't know how many copies there are. So, except one thing, in a very rare situation, if something is patented, it's completely off limits for us. And I keep hearing about features that are off limits to free software or were blocked or somebody tried to block free software. The biggest harm probably is with public key encryption, which was You know, the general use of public key encryption for private mail was set back for about a decade by the patent holders. Anyway, in some cases, to keep our freedom, we may have to do without some desirable feature, which we're not allowed to implement in free software. So will we abandon free software? Well, if most people don't care about the freedom, only the convenience, they'll look at that and they'll say, see, free software is not as good. It doesn't have this neat feature. Free software is a failure. We'll use the non-free software. Of course, for those of us who value freedom, we will interpret the situation differently. We will say, those patent holders are attacking those of us who value our freedom. We just have to fight harder. So will we all throw away our freedom to get the patented features, or will we make somewhat of a sacrifice, not a fatal one, of course, to live in freedom? It depends what we value. Well, at this point, I should mention to you that because of the problem of software patents, I have urged people to boycott Amazon.com because they have a really outrageous software patent, and they've actually gone to the point of suing somebody to try to stop somebody from using this simple feature. So take a look at www.gnu.org, which is the GNU Project website. In the directory philosophy, the file amazon.html, you will find a description of the boycott. So now, I'd like to introduce my alter ego. There's nothing particularly to see behind. I'm Saint Ignatius of the Church of Emacs. I bless your computer, my child. I should explain, first of all, that it's not Ignatius, it's Ignatius. And I'm a saint in the Church of Emacs. Emacs is a text editor that became a way of life and a religion. And we have many of the things that a religion should have, such as hymns, schisms, saints, no gods. We don't want those, but well, there are evil. There is good and evil in our church. But I should point out that unlike some other churches, sainthood in the Church of Emacs does not require celibacy. So if you're considering which church to be a saint in, ours might be a good choice. But it does require a serious moral commitment to a life of purity. You must exorcise the evil proprietary software from your computer and install a wholly free operating system. And only install free software on top of that. If you make a moral commitment to this way of life and you carry it out, you too are a saint in the Church of Emacs. And maybe someday you too will have a halo. This is not a disc platter. This is my halo. It was a disc platter once. Former and I assure you that no proprietary software is accessible on this disc platter.
In the Church of Emacs, what's your definition of free? What free hardware is available running?
Hardware? Well, this issue of free, as in freedom, doesn't really apply to material goods.
How about schematics?
Well, it might be nice
It'd be nice to modify the hardware, you know, fix the bugs in the hardware.
Listen, nobody's going to try to stop you from modifying your computer, although most of the interesting modifications are not feasible because it's hard to modify a chip, other than by frying it. That'll modify it for you. But anyway, and as for freedom to copy it, well, do you have a computer copier? As far as I know, they only exist in Star Trek. With a transporter malfunction, you could copy your computer. But the point is, in general, material objects can't be just duplicated. You can't just make as many as you want. If I wanted another bottle of water, I can't put this into a copier, which will give me out a second and a third, and so on.
It's not as easy as software, but it can be done.
No, it can't. You can make more. You can find more clean water, say, somewhere and bottle it, but you can't copy it. And you can't copy it.
You take the chips off, you photograph the artwork, and you say, here's the artwork.
You can copy the board, but it's difficult. It's so difficult that it's mostly not worth doing, and you can't copy the chips. Nobody can copy a chip. Chips are made by a mass production process. It's the only way to do it. The reason that the moral issues of free software are the way they are is because anybody who can use software can also copy and change the software unless somebody goes out of his way to stop you. It's not that way for hardware. Maybe with some hypothetical like nanotechnology, maybe it will someday be that way for hardware. You know, maybe someday we will be able to copy some food. And at that point, the freedom to copy the food will become tremendously important as a political issue. There is one way in which food can be copied, and that is by planting seeds. And this is a big political issue in the world today. The battle between farmers in most of the world and the companies that want to patent seeds and patent the varieties and patent the genes and prohibit farmers from planting the seeds, or, copy protect the seeds. There was a big battle over that, which is not over entirely. So yes, analogous issues can arise, but for the most part, with material objects, they do not arise. They arise because the very computer that enables you to run the software also enables you to copy and change it unless somebody has gone out of his way to stop you from taking full advantage of your computer.
What about? How do you propose dealing with the applications that are basically too big or too unpleasant for people to willingly work on? I mean, typically you need an interesting problem.
I don't think that there really are very many of those, especially not among published software.
I mean, I think if you...
There are many custom pieces of software used in some company somewhere that are totally boring. These issues mainly apply to published software. They don't apply in the same way to custom software only meant to be used within a company. Basically, anytime a company wants some custom software, they're probably going to have to pay somebody to write it, and that's that.
The thing we need, though, is to this day, everyone's really waiting for word processors and spreadsheets.
There is a free word processor and there is a free spreadsheet. Yes, you're mistaken. You're not waiting. Well, you may be waiting because you don't know.
I'm waiting for something that works well.
Well, what I've heard is that they work reasonably well. No, Star Office is not free software, but ABI Word is free software and Numeric is free software. That's a free word processor and free spreadsheet. No. Well, no. For the most part, please, I want to prevent certain misunderstandings. Free software and open source, they both have two meanings. They refer to certain categories of licenses. That's one meaning. And they refer to certain movements. That's the other meaning. As categories of licenses, they are almost coextensive. So, it's very rare, but there is software which is open source and not free software, or vice versa. There's only one license we have ever come across where the free software movement and the open source movement came to different conclusions about that license. So if you think that there's a lot of software which is open source and not free software, you've probably misunderstood one of these two categories. It's very easy to misunderstand. You have to look at the precise definitions of both of them, or you're likely to misunderstand both of them. Aside from that, these names are also names of two movements. There's the free software movement and the open source movement. And they're totally different in their philosophies. Although the practical recommendations are pretty similar. But the reasons are different.
Did you ever use the Transmato CPU without access to the source code?
I've never used that CPU.
Would you? It had source code for it. It's my understanding.
You mean microcode?
Yeah.
Well, what is it? Basically, I would judge that in terms of, is this something where it really is a computer that I should be able to program, or is this like the inside of a microwave oven? There can be gray areas. That's normal. When you're making ethical distinctions, there are normally gray areas, and you have to decide which side something falls on. And I don't know enough about that to decide.
It's supposed to look like a gray, that the VLS is hidden behind the scenes. The software hides it.
So essentially, it is a microcode. Microcode for 386 architecture. I probably wouldn't care about that unless they could upgrade it.
Their idea is I'm sure that's why they use a VLIW processor. They use code morphing technology.
Code morphing. I don't know what that means. I'm sorry. It's one of those. It's a buzzword. It means nothing unless you've been told. If they can dynamically upgrade that program, then it's got to be free software.
The thing they've got is that it translates x86 architecture into the VLIW.
Well, that's basically what microcode is.
Yeah.
But if it's writable microcode, if you can write that microcode into your chip, then we've got to develop free software for it.
You mean like a flash BIOS sort of thing?
Yeah, there's a person working on a free BIOS because once you can upgrade your BIOS, then you should have a free one.
What Transmato is concerned about is that they want to be able to upgrade the chip and still maintain compatibility.
Well, I don't care what they're concerned about. That's what they want. What they want is not important if it gets in the way of our freedom. We've got to start recognizing, that's the thing, if we think it's just a matter of commercial success or failure, then it makes sense to say, well, here's what this company wants. But when you realize that on one side of this is our freedom, then you realize any company that wants something that collides with our freedom, they're supposed to lose. So basically, if it's upgradable, that once you can install a different one, they better make it free software. This is the first I've heard of any details about that, so I'll have to check into it. But I may be writing about this in the near future.
St. Ignatius, during the first year of its existence, may I purely use GhostScript in its most recent incarnation?
I would only use the one-year-old versions of GhostScript that are free software. Although I'm doing that to be a special purist. The new version of GhostScript is semi-free software. It's free aside from commercial distribution. And that means for an individual dealing with other individuals, you can participate in the community. So it's actually a rather subtle issue why the freedom to commercially distribute the software is essential. The reason is that commercial distribution of free software is very important. It would be a big problem if you couldn't go to the store and buy a CD-ROM with installable systems on it. So basically, a program which can't be included on those CD-ROMs can't be in our system. But if it's semi-free, it does not it doesn't put you in the direct moral dilemma that ordinary proprietary software does. So I for the GNU project, have to reject anything that we can't add to the GNU system. But I wouldn't say it's that you're putting yourself in a moral problem by using a semi-free program as part of, an informal bunch of cooperating people.
Freedom subjective. I mean, it's software for me. I can redistribute as an individual.
Well, you can as long as you don't do it in certain ways. But the community can't make full use of it. Because to make full use of it, we have to be able to have it in the commercial installable system distributions. So it's not subjective, but there are different issues. It's not all one. It's not a simple black and white distinction. There are a number of different distinctions to be made, but these different distinctions are not simply subjective, though.
What about Berkeley?
What about Berkeley?
What's your stance on Berkeley operating license?
You mean the BSD operating systems?
The license.
Well, there are various licenses used on various software in the BSD operating systems. For example, they use GCC, which is released under the GNU GPL. If you're asking about the Berkeley license, you've got to separate that question from asking about the Berkeley system. These are different questions. By the way, when you leave, be sure to take some stickers. They should be out on that table. Take as many stickers as you feel you can make good use of. We've got a whole roll, and I hope that they'll all get made good use of. The Berkeley license is first of all, there are two versions of the Berkeley license. The original Berkeley license is a non-copyleft free software license with a serious practical flaw, which is the obnoxious BSD advertising clause. The revised Berkeley license doesn't have the advertising clause. So it is a non-copyleft free software license with no particular problem being what it is.
But doesn't it have a problem that you can't force redistribution of change?
You can't, well, and that's because it's not copylefted. But I think that's a poor choice of strategy, but it's not a direct practical problem. I'm making finer distinctions. I'm sorry. I like to make fine distinctions because I want to think clearly. I don't want to lump everything together.
If you're a young programmer starting today, what language would you learn first?
Lisp. Lisp is a more powerful language than almost any other. Basically, if it isn't a variant of Lisp or inspired by Lisp, it's not as powerful. The three most exciting things about Lisp, the things it does the minute it starts up, they're called read, eval, and print. Read means it reads an expression and turns it into data structure. Eval means it looks at this expression, which is perfectly transparent data structure, and computes its value. And print means it takes the result, which is a data structure too, and outputs a textual representation of it. Now, these three facilities, in most languages, all three of them are missing. So what can you do with those languages? I mean, they're crippled. Learn Lisp, or learn Scheme, which is a variant of Lisp.
Are there any in this environment?
What was...
Why wasn't it written this?
Lisp, it's hard to implement Lisp very efficiently. So if you want to make something run fast, it's much better to write it in C. We are implementing parts in Lisp. For example, a lot of Emacs is written in Lisp, and many parts of GNOME are implemented in Scheme, which is a version of Lisp. Now, the faster computers get, the more often you can afford to use less than the highest power language, the highest speed language you've got. So more and more we can do things in Scheme and Lisp.
Does the Free Software Foundation have any plans to create some kind of alternative computer algebra system? Or
People have been working on, we've had one that somebody's been working on for about 14 years. Only part-time. I'd really love it if somebody really capable would decide to do a lot of work on it.
What's it called?
It's called Jackal. which stands for Jaffer's Canonical Algebra.
Link that on some physics website?
There should be. If there aren't, send me mail.
Okay.
Are there any RAD development packages available?
Sorry, what are you talking about?
Rapid application, RAD? Similar to...
Yes, Scheme. With Scheme, together with the interface to the graphics toolkit GTK, it's pretty easy to put together any graphical kind of application if you don't need to do a lot of crunching.
Okay, I had a question concerning hardware reverse engineering. One of the issues that affects the viability of an operating system is this hardware support. Increasingly, though, you find a number of hardware vendors who have proprietary closed hardware sets. One example is the DACTEC. The Linux community has had a lot of, the Linux community has had a lot of problems with the DACTEC. Do you see any ethical issues with hardware reverse engineering?
Of course not. There's nothing wrong with that. There's an ethical, it's wrong for them not to publish the specs.
One problem, though, lies in the WIPO treaty that the U.S. has ratified, the World Intellectual Property Treaty, which has the potential to outlaw many forms of hardware reverse engineering.
I'm not sure if, I don't know about that particular treaty, but you know, it may have to be done in countries which don't sign that treaty. But I don't know about that treaty, so maybe you should send me a message telling me which treaty it is. It's a major problem. If we can't do that, the only thing left to do is not buy that hardware.
What happens though when the entire community of vendors slowly just closes up?
It's disaster. You know, what happens if you lose the war, right? You fight the battle today so that you won't lose the war.
You need a better game plan than that.
Thank you very much. When you were providing something better, you know, non-constructive criticism is not useful, and you might as well shut up. If you've got some constructive criticism, if you've got ideas to help, then that's useful.
I love the world that you're talking about, where people help one another and share.
Well, you know something?
But looking at what's happening with the movement of the software, it's not being moved by those factors. And
You're wrong. You're wrong. In any case, you're welcome to your opinions. There's nothing for us to say to each other, though. In saying you just have to do better is nothing but a cheap shot and an unfriendly one.
No, I didn't get
If you want to help us, your help is welcome.
The red tools, for example. You're telling people to write in Scheme.
That's what I believe they should do. Scheme is very good for quickly writing a program. In fact, I don't see how you could be better than that.
But I think if you look at the industry and the way people write code, they don't use tools like this.
I think that they've been foolish on that particular technical issue. I know most people don't use Lisp. Support it. But if you want to know what I recommend, then if you want rapid prototyping of something, write it in Lisp.
Are there efforts to fight the legislation that the patent on algorithms potential ban?
Yes and no. I mean, there are people who want to fight it, but there's nothing big enough to get anywhere.
I recently posted on Technocrat a proposal for combined defensive offensive approach to it, which would involve some angel funding for some of the people making money from free software. But there's a discussion if you search for combined offensive defense on Technocrat, you can read some of it. There's a couple other people that have posted URLs to places where they're thinking about these sorts of things.
Oh, well, I don't browse the web, so I'm not going to do that, but
person with a question. There's a lot of people out there thinking about it. I'm one of them. I don't have it all figured out or anything.
I don't see any solution except to pass a law.
Well, I think that everybody who really despises it thinks that desired end state is to just do away with the current way things are done. But I think that there probably can be some interim measures to take that bifurcated.
Well, I hope so, but I actually have doubts. I think that a patent pool might work if you got enough patent holders to contribute their patents, but it would only be partly effective. Patents, to speak about patents, really, I have to speak for an hour. And I haven't given that speech in maybe 6 years, so I have to refresh my memory about a lot of details, which has slipped my mind. But basically, it's very hard to get a patent pool started, because the pressure on people to join comes when it's big and not when it's small. So nobody's seen how to get one off the ground yet.
How do you feel about a dual licensing versus being licensed?
Well, dual licensing, I don't have any general opinion about it. It depends which two licenses there are and what the alternative is that you might be considering, because it's better than some things and worse than others. So I have no general opinion about it. In a specific case, if you proposed if you were writing a program and you proposed a particular pair of licenses, that would have certain specific consequences depending on what those two licenses are, and that would be better than some alternatives and worse than others.
I am a minority owner in a real vertical market software company, and trying, as we're getting ready to do software, to convince or find ways to convince my partners that finding a way to open source our software would still allow us to make money.
Okay, I'm not the one who can help you do that. For one thing, I have nothing to do with open source. And I don't like to use that term, but I will acknowledge that the open source movement may be the people who can help you best in doing that particular thing. They focus on looking for ways you can try to convince your boss that it will be profitable. So take a look at their website and talk to them, and maybe they can help you. I focus on different things. I don't think as much about why it might be profitable for your company, so I can't help you as much as they can, but I focus more on issues of why it's good for society as opposed to whether it's good or bad for a particular company.
Well, I guess the question is, do you have, other than, opensource.org, do you have anything on the Free Software Foundation?
No, we don't focus on trying to convince a company that it's profitable to let people have freedom. We focus on saying why you shouldn't leave it up to some company to decide whether you have freedom.
I know the Free Software Foundation has generally supported two licenses, the general public license and the lesser, or formerly called library public license. If you created a new body of code designed to link against other products tomorrow that no one else has, would you license it under the general public license or the lesser public license?
Okay, let me explain. Using the ordinary GPL implies that I'm writing a module which can be included in other larger programs. Well, if I release it under the ordinary GPL, then it can only be included in a larger program if the whole thing is free software. If I release it under the lesser GPL, it's called lesser because it doesn't insist on that. So that would permit linking it into a larger program which was not free software. And basically, I look at that as a strategic choice. I would say, which one is going to provide greater strength to the free software movement in the future, as best I can tell. And that's how I would make a choice. So basically, I would say, essentially, if I take the firm or confrontational stand, do I think I'm going to win or lose? If I think I'm going to lose, then I won't do it. If I think this is an opportunity to do it and win, I'll do it. Because it's a long-term campaign to make software free. And if I have if I develop a module that does some unique, interesting, powerful job, not commonly available modules to do this job, then I figure I'll limit it to free software only, because that will provide an advantage to everybody who's developing free software. They'll be able to use this module to do that job. Whereas, if modules to do that job are available everywhere, and it's just that we didn't have one before. In that case, I figure if I put more limitations on using our module, people will just use some other instead. We don't gain anything from that. So in that case, we might as well say, all right, in this case, we'll relax the requirements and say you can use this module even in a non-free program. Now I should mention that there's a particular module called gnu+linux, which is it's an input editor. It's something that you can put into an interactive programming to give you Emacs-style editing for the input lines. And there are several pieces of software that weren't free before, but the people tried to use gnu+linux in them. And when I found out about that, I sent them mail and said, you can't use gnu+linux in a non-free program, and they made their programs free software.
How do both instances of the GPL differentiate between individuals as entities and corporations as entities?
They don't.
So it's possible for a corporation to modify free software and distribute it within the corporation?
They can use it internally, and that's not really distribution.
Okay.
But if they started providing it to some other companies, that's distribution.
Can they extend their orders as an entity through the use of non-disclosure agreements?
No. If it's outside the company, then it's distribution, which means that they must release it under the GPL. They can't just arbitrarily decide to treat people outside the company as if they were inside the company. But people who are, if it's really used within the company, that's different.
So does that mean they can't hire contractors to work on it?
I'm not sure. If it were really hiring somebody to come into the company and work on the code there for them, they probably can. They can probably legitimately argue, we're not distributing this, we're not releasing this.
But what does into mean in that case?
I don't know, but the point is that you're looking at this the wrong way, the fundamental wrong way. You're trying to make a chain of things that are close to each other, which leads from this extreme to that extreme, and argue that you can't draw a line anywhere between them. Well, that's totally wrong reasoning, because legally there is a line, and one of those links is going to break. It's the way it works. That's the way the law deals with this kind of A is similar to B, which is similar to C, which is similar to D, which is similar to E, which is similar to Z, but we know A and Z are supposed to be treated differently. The answer is somewhere at some point, between, say, G and H, they're going to draw the line. And it's hard to be sure exactly where it's going to be drawn, but if they tried to use this to get Z to be treated like A, it wouldn't work. There hasn't been yet.
Earlier you talked about the community that you were a part of that died with the sharing of software. If that community has survived instead of the more proprietary models you've seen, like with, say, Windows and the Macintosh driving both software and hardware, what do you think it would look like today?
I have no idea. I'm sorry. I don't think anything. I don't know. I can't begin to imagine a counterfactual like that.
Take on Amazon instead of the patent office. They're both ridiculous.
Well, I see a good opportunity to take on Amazon, and I don't see any opportunity to take on the patent office. They both deserve it.
Despite the vast difference in terminology, motivation, and values between the open source movement and the free software movement, we would agree that so-called open source licenses qualify as free software licenses.
It depends. Most of them do, some of them don't.
You spoke earlier.
I have to look at the particular license in general.
You spoke earlier of the harm that comes, the psychosocial harm that comes to the community when people have to walk away and say, I can't use that, and therefore it doesn't get used as much as it might. Have you considered modifying the GPL to allow it to link with free software that meets your criteria that may not be under the GPL setting?
I don't see any way to do that. To do that, I would need a legal criterion for what constitutes free software, and I don't think I can write one.
You couldn't do something analogous to the open source
I don't think that's reliable, no. The open source definition, as they will tell you, is meant to be interpreted by them. it wasn't designed to be so bulletproof that they could entrust a court to interpret it and get the right answers. I don't know anyone who I would have confidence in to write a legally bulletproof definition of free software to anticipate the things that can go wrong in the future. I don't trust myself to be able to do that. I don't have confidence that I can get it right, and I don't know anyone else I could expect it to either. I think the best solution is basically release your code under the GPL, and then all the GPL covered programs can link with all the others. More than half the packages being announced on FreshMeat are GPL covered. Basically, the only reason anybody uses something else is typically because they're a company and they don't really care that much about our community, and they're trying to sort of contribute somewhat, but jerk us around some, and it's not good.
But then you've got projects like Mozilla that are free software, and yet you use GPL software.
That's right.
Even in a free.
Well, I say basically we should go to Netscape and tell them you think they should dual license Mozilla under the GPL. Basically, I won't say that they're an enemy. They're not. It's free software. It's not evil. But there is a tug of war going on here, and I think that the GPL is a better approach than the MPL, and I don't think that the GPL should give way in this tug of war.
But does it have
I think they should.
If you were to have a version of the GPL that would allow you to link with MPL code, that would still not allow Netscape to release the GPL code in their version.
I know, but there's no way to do that. That's reasonable. Should I run it for should I list the MPL? No, I can't. I can't. I'm sorry. I can't. It's too hard a job. It's easy said and not possible to do.
Could somebody make an effort to see if it can be?
You can try, but I won't trust the results. I will not risk the whole body of GPL covered software on betting that you or that I did that job right. It's too hard a job. I thought about what makes it hard. You're just thinking about why it might be nice. But there's another reason why I think it might be a mistake, which is that basically the whole idea of the GPL is when people add to the GPL covered code, they cannot add any other restrictions. And you're talking about basically having a very large category of possible restrictions that they could add. And I think that leads to a chaotic situation. I don't think it's good. Now, maybe in a few special cases, it might be a good change. Now, maybe there will be, in GPL version 3, I'm thinking that maybe I will list a small number of possible kinds of requirements people could add when they add code, which could solve a small set of problems which are common problems. But there will be a very limited set of possible things that people could say. Because that's something where I could write it and be confident that there's no bug in what I'm writing. If I try to make it general, I could put a bug into that. It's too much of a risk. I will not risk it. What do you mean by commercial? What do you mean? Do you really mean proprietary when you're saying commercial?
I mean proprietary, yes.
Okay, please do. Commercial free software is a good thing, but if you use commercial to mean non-free, in effect you're implicitly telling people there is no commercial free software. That's not good to tell people. So if somebody violates the GPL by putting some GPL covered code into a proprietary program, and then you were asking?
How would you know they did that?
Well, it depends. I mean, we don't have X-ray vision, but we might figure it out. If we suspected it, when we went to court, the court could demand to investigate their source code and check. And
there's a company which are the run out of the Morningstar folks who are selling a quote Linux-based router and not releasing any of their source code. What is your response?
Well, it sounds like they're probably violating the GPL. Now, I'm not sure what Linux-based means. Because of the way people use the term Linux ambiguously, I don't know if they mean Linux properly speaking, which is the kernel that Linus wrote, or if they're talking about the GNU/Linux system and calling it Linux. There's no way to tell.
I think it's pretty clear that they have the Linux kernel sources, which are subject to the GPL in there.
Then it's copyright holders of the kernel who are in a position to legally enforce that.
Are those the only people who have
Yes.
standing?
Yes. Now, if they have included the whole GNU/Linux system, if, for example, there's the GNU-C library in there, which is copyright Free Software Foundation, then we are in a position to enforce it. So it really makes a difference whether it's Linux or GNU/Linux. And if you can find out more about what they're doing, what's included in there, and tell me if there is any substantial FSF copyrighted piece in what they're distributing, and they're not obeying the GPL for that, then we can go after them, and we have the money to really sue them. We didn't have to sue them. We told them, well, actually, it wasn't FSF copyrighted stuff that was misusing. They complied. An author was complaining to them, and he seemed to mean what he was saying. Remember to take a look at the stickers and take some if you want some, as you go.
If one of us were to sit down in front of your original Linux machine, 67 or 68, what would we recognize?
Wait, 67 or 68, what?
How long ago did you say you wrote?
The first Emacs was in 75.
Sorry.
You'd recognize most of a lot of the basic commands. Well, the basic, 1 and 2 character editing commands, a lot of them would be the same.
Did you have multiple buffers?
Yes, and multiple windows. It had 2 windows only.
Well, then the dumb question is, where'd you get the idea?
Which idea?
The idea of making things so different from VI and different from...
There was no VI then.
So different from...
Well, some of the ideas were mine and some of the ideas were Guy Steele's. Guy Steele actually laid out the command set for the original Emacs. And some of the ideas came from the previous editors that had been developed at the AI lab.
If we're between questions, why don't we leave Rich Stallman a hand for talking?
If he's writing a piece of free software, should he assign the copyright to the FSF? Well, it's up to you. I mean, you can do it either way. If you assign the copyright to us, then we will enforce it. So we can then threaten to sue people who violate the GPL, and they're likely to be more scared of us because they know we have enough money to actually sue them, and we have a law firm and so on.
Please ask questions in a moderate volume.
No, you can make it as loud as you want.
But not soft. Please.
Okay, I have a question. I was just saying about computers. How long do you think it will take for the GPL to break outside the box of computers to hang up in the field? In other fields like publishing, not just manual, but publishing like pulp fiction books.
Oh, okay, there's a bit of a it's a good question, but but the way you put it is a bit confused, because really
in manufacturing and engineering and things that have...
Well, for some of those issues, they're just not ethically analogous. But for publishing, publishing more and more is going to be done through computers. So the issues of freedom somewhat more or less apply to things other than software that can be published on your computer, like fiction, like dictionaries, like songs, and some of these are becoming big issues right now. And basically it's a battle between the companies that want to control all distribution and in fact even force you to pay every time you play a song or every time you read a book. And the tendency of computers to give you the ability easily redistribute these things. But I have to say that the issue, there's some areas in which the issues are analogous, and some areas where different kinds of works vary. The area where they're analogous is sharing with your friend. No matter what kind of work it is, you should always have the freedom to share it with your friend if it's published, because it attacks the spirit of goodwill in society to tell you can't. So whether it's a program or a game or a map or a novel or a dictionary or whatever, you should always be able to be free to occasionally share it with your friends. Beyond that, the other freedoms, whether those are socially important, depends on what kind of work it is, or at least that's the view I've come to. So for software and for some other things like manuals, textbooks to teach any subject, the definition of free is very big. You have to be free to publish an improved version. Likewise for reference works like dictionaries, you should be free to publish an improved version so the community can develop it and fully use it. And then, say, for scholarly papers, everybody should be free to republish verbatim, but changing a scholarly paper is bad. Nobody should do that. And then for fiction, well, novel, maybe for novels, maybe it's okay if you can only privately distribute it to your friends. For songs, I tend to think that we will be able to have a system where everybody can republish the recorded song. They'll put it on your website and just let everybody copy it, but as long as it's verbatim. And then when you play it, a box will pop up that says, click here to send the band $1. And that's how musicians will make their money, through voluntary, basically it's throw $1 into the musician's guitar case with your mouth. and in this way, it'll be possible to have people even not just privately distributing it, but even publicly. You put it on your website for everyone to copy, because if they like it, some of them will send $1 too. And so this way we'll have musicians making a living probably basically as well as they do now, and yet without the restrictions that the music industry is trying to place on us. Now, if it comes to, say, maybe for song lyrics, perhaps there, the folk process, as people change them, is a valuable thing for society. So maybe you should be free to republish modified song lyrics too, so that the folk process can work.
The restaurant is going to close.
Yeah, I'm afraid it's time I gotta go. Please do take a look. There's also another site called www.4cite.org, which is a site about the fight against UCEDA. Take a look at it. The fight will come to Ohio.
Get a good recording?
Buy a book.
Wire run that light I'm gonna walk out. Oh yeah.